on today's StoryBeat.
My big advice is do your homework. See what's been made before you go make your film. Not because you want to copy it, you need to understand the context in which you're making something and what's been done before. And even watching films that maybe you don't love. What do you love about it? What don't you love about it? What works about it for you? What doesn't work for you? I just think it's important that people just spend more time just watching as many films as possible.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, documentary film director Laura Gabbert, has made critically acclaimed films that deploy humor and emotion to tell penetrating, character-driven stories about American culture and society. Among her documentaries, Food and Country premiered at the 2023 Sundance Film Festival and was released theatrically in October 2024. Laura's film Ottolenghi and the Cakes of Versailles explores chef Yotam Ottolenghi's collaboration with the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She also directed City of Gold, which is about Pulitzer Prize winning food writer Jonathan Gold. City of Gold was named by Vogue Magazine among their 65 best documentaries of all time. Additional feature work includes the documentaries No Impact Man, Sunset Story, and the short film Monumento. Her TV work includes the Netflix shows Ugly Delicious and Disclosure. Most recently, Laura completed the 6-part nonfiction series The Power of Film, based on the work of legendary UCLA film scholar Professor Howard Suber. The series premiered on Turner Classic Movies in January of 2024. For the record, Laura and I know one another from The Power of Film as I became involved in this exceptional project as a co-executive producer. Like Laura, I'm a UCLA MFA graduate and one of Howard Suber's former students. Howard has been a guest on StoryBeat, and his episode is one of this show's most downloaded. So for all those reasons and many more, I'm truly delighted to have the gifted documentarian Laura Gabbert join me today. Laura, welcome to StoryBeat.
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate you inviting me to do this.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I'm delighted to have you here. So let's go back in time just a little bit. How old were you when you first started to notice movies, motion pictures, filming, and especially documentaries?
You know, I grew up in the suburbs of Minneapolis in the 70s and 80s, and my parents were not big movie buffs. So they were very interested in performing arts and the visual arts, but they were not big moviegoers. And even when I went to undergrad on the East Coast. There was not a film department or a media studies department. I think I would go see movies at the local theater sometimes, but I didn't really get the movie bug until I lived in New York City, and then shortly after that in San Francisco, where there were so many great art house theaters
Oh, sure.
and film festivals. And I started going to film festivals, and I started going to the movies, 3 or 4 times a week, and just completely got the bug then. It
Mhm.
wasn't until I was about 23 or 24 years old.
Oh, so it wasn't as a little kid then.
No, not at all.
That's actually kind of unusual.
Yeah.
Most people who are on this show, they've got the bug, they're 4 or 5, 6, sometimes 8 or 9, but you're talking about in your 20s.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't even, I think I loved movies and I loved television shows, but I didn't conceptualize it as something I could do. And it also just wasn't, I was a big reader. I probably was more of a reader than anything else. I loved novels
Mhm.
and was a voracious reader growing up. But I think it wasn't until I was well out of college that I just thought to myself, I guess people do this and maybe I should take a class. Maybe I should learn a little bit more about it and see if this is something I want to pursue.
And where did you go? Did you take a class somewhere?
I did. I was living in San Francisco and I took a class, like an intro to filmmaking class at UC Berkeley Extension. And then I took an editing class and I loved that even more. And it was like the early 90s in San Francisco, sort of recessionary times. I was waitressing and doing odd jobs. And I got a job well, first it was an apprenticeship working with some filmmakers, kind of independent and avant-garde filmmakers in San Francisco. And I was an apprentice editor, and then I became an assistant editor.
Is that where your interest first began with docs, was working for them?
Yeah, I worked for some doc filmmakers early on in San Francisco.
So it wasn't something that you thought about prior to working with them?
Nope, I really hadn't. And when I, especially working with these filmmakers in San Francisco, there was something about watching people edit docs. I just thought to myself, I think I can do this. It felt accessible, it felt more accessible than big feature films, Hollywood films.
Mm-hmm.
And also I loved that it was about real life and real people. And I love narrative films too, but there was something about it that I felt like I could step into that and try it.
It attracted you because it had that realistic quality to it,
Yeah.
more so than a fantasy movie might.
Correct. That's right.
And I suppose in some ways, documentaries can feel fantasy-like
Mhm.
if the person or persons that you're documenting are kind of really unusual.
Sure, absolutely. Well, you are entering into a very different world with a different with a different environment, with a different sort of language and rules. And I always loved that too, that you can, I mean, the beauty of being a documentary filmmaker is you're granted access into somebody's world and you actually get to
Mm-hmm.
live in that for a while
Oh, sure.
in a very intimate way.
It's very interesting because if you think about it, I know you have heard, many people have heard famous actors talk about the reason why they act is because they can inhabit someone else's skin in the way they are.
Yeah.
And so you're having a similar thing, only it's in the real world.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So when did you then eventually go to UCLA? How long was it before you did that?
Let's see, I worked as an assistant editor in San Francisco for a couple of years. Then I wanted to get some production experience. So I did some stints in New York working in independent film production, and then kind of came back to San Francisco. And I just thought, it's now or never. I applied to one school, which was UCLA,
Mm-hmm.
and got in and made the leap to Los Angeles.
And did you learn more about documentary filmmaking at UCLA?
I did. However, UCLA at that time didn't have a lot of documentary classes. They had the renowned documentarian Marina Goldskaya, who taught a production documentary class and a critical studies in documentary film. She was my main sort of conduit, and she was wonderful, and she was a mentor, as was Howard Suber, because I think that a lot of the things that Howard Suber teaches are completely applicable to documentary films as well.
Oh, no doubt. Well, it's still storytelling, isn't
It's
it?
a storytelling. That's right.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about that over time in the show, but documentaries are still a story. It's like I tell people all the time, at night when you turn on your nightly news on the TV, they're telling you tonight's top story.
That's right.
It's a story. It still has a beginning, middle, and end. It has all those characteristics. Did you take narrative classes at UCLA as well?
I did. Yeah. And I was in the producers program. I wasn't in the directors program. When I applied to film school, I wasn't quite I loved editing, but I thought I really wanted to be a producer because I thought it would be sort of overseeing and kind of combining all the things I loved about movies. And as a documentary filmmaker, I produce all my movies too, usually with other producers on board. So those skills came in handy for sure. I really learned about directing more by doing
Mm-hmm.
after film school.
But you applied, I assume, what you learned in the narrative classes to making any kind of documentary.
Absolutely, without a doubt. And I would say in particular, Howard Super's class, his classes on structure and storytelling made the biggest impression on me.
Well, that certainly shows up in the power of film, and we're going to talk more about that too. Now, you have clearly in your catalog of movies you've made, you have a wide range of interests, though I see that there's a slight emphasis on food. You've done a bunch of stuff with food. Is there a reason why? Was that something you gravitated toward, or was it just came your way?
Yeah, my most recent, aside from The Power of Film, the series, my most recent documentaries have all been food related, but very different from one another. The first one I did, City of Gold, is about the late, great Jonathan Gold, who was the food writer here at the LA Times, only food writer to win a Pulitzer Prize. I wanted to make a film about him because he is the person, his writing made me fall in love with Los Angeles. So he had a huge influence on me when I moved to Los Angeles. I had lived in cities like New York and San Francisco and Minneapolis that are much more traditional cities. They don't have the sort of the sprawl. And I was overwhelmed by Los Angeles, and I didn't like it at first. And I moved to LA with a lot of prejudices about it without having lived here.
It's easy to have those prejudices.
Yeah. But I started reading Jonathan Gold, and he had such a beautiful way of talking about food and restaurants in LA, but kind of through this sort of, he was like a cartographer. Like he was exploring neighborhoods and cultures and communities through these restaurants. And it got me out of my comfort zone in Los Angeles, going to grad school in Westwood, where UCLA is.
Hmm.
And I started to really discover the magic of the city. And I just fell in love with his writing, and I began to fall in love with LA. And yeah, and my kids were young at that point, and I remember I thought, I don't want to travel. I don't want to I can't go away for 3 months and shoot something. I know I'll approach Jonathan Gold. Maybe he'll let me make a documentary about him.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And obviously he did.
Well, he said no for a long time.
Isn't that part of the process of a documentarian, is overcoming the many no's that
It
you're always
is.
going to get?
It really is. Yeah, he said no originally because, well, I think he's a writer. He didn't really want to be on camera. He also was kind of anonymous then as a food critic, so he said, I can't do it, which actually wasn't totally true because he had already won the Pulitzer in 2007, so people knew what he looked like and all of that. So we had some ground rules for starting it. He was just very tentative and he was reluctant. He had seen one of my films and liked it, so that's why he was willing to talk to me. But it took a number of coffee dates with him. He was always said yes to meeting me for coffee. But at the end of the conversation, he would say no.
You got to have coffee with one of the great food critics of all time.
Yeah. Well, then I spent 5 years filming with him,
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So, but the reason he finally said yes was that I said, this isn't really a film about you, Jonathan. It's really about the city you love, Los Angeles. And it's really a film that's going to be told through your point of view, but the city is front and center, And I think that he thought about that for a while, and he's like, okay, well, we'll give it a try. We'll give it a try for a while.
And 5 years later.
5 years later, yeah. But we had an agreement that he could pull out for the first year or so. He could just stop. We didn't sign a contract. We just said, let's see how it goes.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we did.
And I'll bet you saw a lot of very interesting restaurants in that time.
I spent a lot of time in Jonathan's big green pickup truck traversing Los Angeles and eating a lot of places. And yeah, I now look back on that and think, God, I was so lucky that I was able to spend that time with him.
No kidding. I mean, how many people got to do that?
No.
Probably just you.
Yeah, me and his closest friends he would bring along to meals and that kind of thing. So it was a privilege.
All right, so let's break down the job of a documentary filmmaker a little bit. Where do you begin? Obviously, you need a subject. That's the first thing, isn't it? Because you don't go out and shoot. You've got to have something you're shooting about. So how do you decide, I want to work on this? You clearly had a reason why you decided Jonathan Gold, and it was a good reason. I'm glad you said it. What do you look for a subject to work on?
Oh, gosh, I think it's a hard thing to define. And the documentaries I've made have come about through different circumstances. So with City of Gold and Jonathan Gold, it was a film that I felt like intuitively I knew how to make it.
Okay.
It was just a gut feeling, and I was excited about it. And I really thought that it could be a film that showed sort of the craft of what it means to be a critic. You could kind of get inside that process of being an actual cultural critic.
Sure.
I was really interested in that. I thought it could be very cinematic because we were exploring all aspects of Los Angeles. I thought it could kind of subvert the notions or the prejudices people have about Los Angeles. And I was sort of hell-bent on doing that because I had been one of those people. I thought that his writing could be a real component of the film, that we could hear his voice or someone reading his writing as we were seeing Los Angeles. And because his writing had been so moving to me and sort of revelatory to me, I really could see that film as having these different components of visual and music and the sounds of Los Angeles, as well as his writing kind of woven through.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that film was a little bit different in that it's almost more of an essay film, and it doesn't have a true beginning, middle, and end. I mean, of course it does. We came up with a structure for it. So it's a very different film than something like Ottolenghi and the Cakes of Versailles, which I did not come up with that idea. I was hired as a director. They brought the concept to me, but what I liked about it is that it did have a clear beginning, middle, and end. And I was also a fan of Yotam Ottolenghi, the very well-known chef and cookbook author. And that film is centered around a collaboration he's doing with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where they're putting on an event. I knew there would be a beginning, middle, and end.
Mm-hmm.
He was trying to pull off something, right?
Right.
There was a bit of a ticking clock kind of aspect to it. He was bringing in different pastry chefs from all over the world. It was going to be at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is,
Fantastic.
gorgeous to shoot. That's fantastic. We were going to travel to London and Versailles, and there was enough there as a filmmaker, just as a filmmaker, but also for me personally.
Somehow that doesn't seem like a burden to have to go to Versailles.
Yes. And shoot in the Hall of Mirrors with no tourists.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So, things like that were kind of enticing. And as a filmmaker, you're trying to figure out the story, but you're also, it's like, is this going to be cinematically dynamic and arresting? And how can I use all these different components to tell the story?
But you had a kind of a contained story to begin with.
I did.
Which is not always true for documentary filmmakers who sometimes just go out and start shooting a subject.
Yeah.
And you find your movie.
And I always tell people when I mentor several young filmmakers these days, and I always really encourage people to, even though they don't know exactly what the story is, to write a treatment. When they get the idea, try to imagine what the story might be. So you have a beginning, middle, and end. And will there be any conflict in it? And what will the evolution of the character be, if there is any?
Mm-hmm. Because you still need a protagonist, don't you?
Yeah. I think you need. Not every documentary has one protagonist. I just made a film that has one central kind of character with a large group of people kind of, radiating out from her. I think you need to have a feeling of what you want to happen. And if you can hit those emotional beats, like what you sort of imagine happening doesn't have to happen. But if you know what those emotional beats are or what you want to evoke, then you know to look for them as you're filming.
So it helps to then have thought it through in advance, knowing full well you're not scripting it.
Right.
So you can't guarantee that those things are going to happen,
Nope.
But you can look for those. Yes?
You can look for those. And then you can also, you're not staging things, but you can ask your subject, the character that you're following, do you do anything like this that might kind of fit what you're looking for?
Mm-hmm.
You start to kind of hone in on opportunities to hit those emotional beats, if that makes sense.
Do you ever ask people to do things a second time?
I do. Yeah. I'm not a true, cinema verite. I have ethics and rules and guidelines, and I try not to do that early on in the process of working with someone. But I think as soon as one of the key things you need to do as a documentary filmmaker is build trust with your subject. And I always say documentaries are only as good as the trust that allows them to be made. So once you have that trust, they start to understand that, oh, okay, she just wants me to do that again for safety, or she wants me to walk in a different way, or she wants me to say it again differently.
Mm-hmm.
So I try not to do that early on in the process and in the relationship, but I definitely do that.
All right. So do you then have in your mind's eye typically what a good story will be from a particular subject? Do you know what a good story will be ahead of time?
Yeah, sometimes I'm wrong. I've started projects that I haven't fit, that I've kind of abandoned because the story doesn't sort of pan out. But yeah, I feel like I have a pretty good sense for it. And for me, it's not just story. It is are we exploring kind of juicy ideas through making this somehow?
How often do you get off into the field and something happens that changes your whole way of going about it or the way that you're thinking about it? Does that happen often or not?
I would say not very often.
Not often.
Not very often, but I will say that at least with City of Gold, what I found was that we would go to these restaurants with Jonathan, with my tiny crew. We would film him eating there. We would quickly run back into the kitchen and get some B-roll of the preparation of the food, the work in the kitchen. And I realized we just didn't have enough time to do both. So what I would do then is go back a second time and just kind of shoot out the kitchen and all the details of the restaurant so I could take my time. When I started doing that, I started talking to these restaurant owners and discovered that they had these incredible immigrant stories, about their families or about themselves, and how coming to Los Angeles and opening up a restaurant and cooking food for their communities, whether it's Thai or Ethiopian or whatever, gave them this great entry to prosperity in America. And it was sort of the flip side. It's what you don't read in Jonathan Gold's food reviews, is how do these reviews of these restaurants then impact these chefs?
Sure, of course not.
That's an example of spending time shooting and realizing, oh, there's another point of view I want to weave into this film.
So that becomes a kind of sort of back-ended research. You didn't set out with that
Correct.
to research it. It comes out of the process itself. How much research do you typically do on most of your shoots before you go out?
I try to do a lot. I love research. It's like one of my favorite things about it. I just try to learn as much as I possibly can. I try to read everything I can. I mean, even when we were doing Ottolenghi and we were shooting at Versailles, I was like, I think I really need to review my history of, Versailles and the French
Sure.
Revolution. And because then you go there and you shoot it differently because of that.
And isn't it convenient that that's where they were let them eat cake?
Yes, that's right. And it was a film about pastries. So, or what was, it's one of the things the film was about.
All right. So, what do you think are the most important steps then in the development of a story or going toward a story to make a documentary? What are those important steps that you do now pretty typically every time you go out?
I mean, there's a number of things. I mean, I like we were just talking, just like a lot of research and development, like reading as much as I can about it, writing about it, sort of coming up with questions that I need to ask the subject. As I said, writing a treatment, really writing out, what does this film look like? Like, what does my imagination say this film could look like? What could happen, right? There'll be surprises along the way. It may not go exactly that way, but it's a very critical exercise, I think. I think the other thing is really making sure, I mean, access. Do I have all of the access to this subject that I need? I worked on, I can't name names, but I worked on, after City of Gold, I started working on a film about a very well-known contemporary artist here in LA.
Mm-hmm.
And we started filming and we were given access. But as we got further and further along, they started kind of throwing up barriers.
Uh-oh.
And we had to abandon that project because without the access, I couldn't make the film I wanted to make.
How often do you need clearance? Is that a big problem?
When you say clearance, what do you mean?
Well, so for instance, when you went to Versailles, did you need to get clearance to shoot in Versailles?
Oh, yes. And it cost thousands and thousands of dollars in a location fee.
And then was it the same in City of Gold where you'd go to a restaurant? Did you need to get clearances from the people there?
So very different with City of Gold, depending upon the restaurant. I mean, I would let them know that we were coming, or Jonathan would do the favor and ask them for us. A lot of them were just tiny little places. They weren't kind of well-known fancy restaurants. And sometimes I would be filming with Jonathan. He'd be like, hey, let's stop here for lunch. So I'd have no time to do that. So for those places, we didn't. I mean, I always get a location agreement for liability reasons, and you just get them to sign that.
Right.
So yeah, if you're shooting at Versailles, that's weeks of negotiation and paying them a handsome price to shoot there before it opens. But if it's a little tiny, Vietnamese pho shop in San Gabriel Valley in Los Angeles, no, they're happy to have you film there, especially if you're with Jonathan Gold.
Well, sure. Because they know that they're likely to get a little publicity out of it.
Yeah.
And they better hope that their food is good that day. That's for sure.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So it depends. It depends.
So when you're starting, do you usually have a specific end goal in mind? Do you know where you're headed? Is that one of the secrets?
Oh, you mean an entire documentary? Do I know that?
Yes. When you begin, I know you spent 5 years with Jonathan Gold. I can't imagine you knew how it was going to end over 5 years.
No.
Maybe you did.
No, because that film, again, really is not there's no kind of plot.
It's more episodic.
It's more episodic. It's more thematic. It's more evocative. It's more of a feeling and a tone and those kinds of things. But as I said, I always write out treatments and I always try to imagine how it might end.
I think most docs that I've seen that I really like and they meant something to me elicit some kind of emotion. They're emotional in some way, just like any good narrative movie would. It would hit you in your gut. Is there something that you do when you're shooting that you're looking for that is going to help you elicit that kind of empathy and understanding and emotional impact?
I mean, there's not one thing. I think that, for me, it's really just the combination. I think there's so much emotion. Okay, in a film like City of Gold, there's no big conflict. And Jonathan told me that. He's like, I'm not going to give you any conflict. Like, I'm a critic. This is what I do. And I was like, that's fine. I'm not looking for that.
Well, some people might think of the criticism as conflict, but that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, but one of our ground rules was that I couldn't film him in real time reviewing a restaurant. That wasn't ethical. So we were mostly going to restaurants he had reviewed before.
Got it.
There's a couple times where we didn't. But for me, it was much more a way of emotion comes out of the filmmaking. It comes out of the cutting. It comes out of the music. It comes out of what Jonathan says about learning about different communities and cultures in Los Angeles, and that's emotional, that's a beautiful thing. And if it's shot the right way and cut the right way, it creates emotion. It's moving.
Sure, of course. And some of those things come out of whatever you find in post that are juxtapositions of one thing to another.
A lot of it comes out in the editing. Yeah, it comes out in the shooting and the editing. It comes out, we spent on that film, I think in most documentaries, there's B-roll. It's like kind of setting up those exterior shots and the locations and the details. And those are usually done quickly the morning of a shoot, or maybe in 1 or 2 days. We spent weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks shooting B-roll of Los Angeles.
Wow.
That's a vast city.
Yes, it is.
It's a horizontal city. It doesn't say LA to you in one shot, unless you have like the beach and a palm tree. We had a goal of shooting Los Angeles in a way that you don't typically see Los Angeles, but people who live here recognize it. And we had all these kind of goals. If we're going to shoot the Hollywood sign, we shoot it from an angle that we don't typically see.
Right.
Like we had kind of some rules that when we broke them, we chose to break them.
Well, yeah, I assume you were trying to make it unique in some way.
Well, you're trying to make it a cohesive whole, not unique just for the sake of being unique, but that somehow fits the subject matter, fits Jonathan Gould's kind of, take and view on Los Angeles.
I think I have the right person. I could be wrong, but I believe it was H.L. Mencken, the great writer, who once said of Los Angeles, there is no there.
Right.
But you're saying that you went and through Jonathan Gould found the there that's there.
That's correct. And it was very much informed by his writing and just spending time with him. And then I worked very closely with my cinematographer, Jerry Henry. Whereas even when we were cutting the film, Jerry would come into the edit room and I'd be like, we need shots of Koreatown sort of from this POV or these angles. And he's brilliant. And he would go out and do that and then do all sorts of other really incredible things. He was very invested in us capturing Los Angeles in a certain way and did a great job.
So you say that you start many movies and you advise people to sit down and do some kind of an outline or some kind of a treatment or whatever you want to call it to get them to, or to get you to the point where you can go out and shoot certain things and make sure you cover. I assume that that's part of the research process.
Yeah.
I need to shoot this, and this in order to make the story work if there's going to be a story there.
It's that, and it's also, it primes you so you seize opportunities that may fit those points in your treatment in an emotional way, if not literally.
Mm-hmm. Do you then think about going back to UCLA now and like Howard's structure class and various other kinds of classes in narrative filmmaking, do you then sit down and think structurally in 7 plot points, or do you think that way?
I mean, not maybe in 7 plot points exactly, but I think more about, I can give you an example. When we were making a film called Sunset Story that was one of my first films. The film takes place in a retirement home for political radicals from Los Angeles. And we originally thought we were making a film about kind of the history of the social movement through the eyes of these residents. And we discovered 2 women who had moved there within a couple of weeks of each other who kind of became best friends. And we found while we were making it that the film was really about these 2 women in this place. It wasn't about the place and the history. And in the editing room, I remember sort of realizing, oh my God, we're telling a love story. This is a love story.
Interesting. And you had no idea you were going there when you started.
No. And I remember thinking about Howard, and it's like, most love stories end with the separation or the death of one of the lovers. And like that happened in the film. But we re-edited, restructured the film with that thought.
It evolved that way. You didn't start out with that intention.
Correct. Yep.
And to me, that's everything I've ever known about documentaries and other documentarians I've spoken to, and we'll talk about Doug Prey shortly. He's also a documentarian, that evolution is part of the beauty of the process, is that you discover in the making of the movie. Now, a narrative filmmaker can discover too in the making of the movie,
Sure.
but there's probably a little narrower of an opportunity to do that in a scripted movie.
That's correct. I think that's right.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it's one of the risks in making a documentary, but it's also one of the great joys.
I imagine it is. Do you have a particular rule or a thought as to how much footage you're going to need to shoot in order to make a movie?
I don't. I mean, it just depends, completely depends upon the movie. It depends upon, I'm constantly watching things we shoot and sort of assessing if we need more in a certain place. In the case of the film Ottolenghi and the Cakes of Versailles, we had the money raised. It was a certain amount of money. We had locations. We only had a certain amount of time. We shot it in 10 days.
That helps you, doesn't it? Because you're really locked in that box.
Well, I like having, not always, but I appreciate having it contained.
I
Right?
agree.
I think that you can be more creative in times when you really know what the limitations are.
In the many different projects I've done in my life, the ones that I always thought came out the best were the ones where you were constricted in some way.
Yep.
You either didn't have enough money, you didn't have enough time, you didn't have the resources you need in some way.
Yep.
And that forces you to be creative within that context.
That's correct. I find the exact same thing to be true.
And if you have total freedom to do whatever you want for as long as you want, it's just a big sprawling mess sometimes.
Yeah. Or if you don't have like a time deadline, I always impose it. I just say, we are applying to these festivals on these dates and we have to be done.
That's helpful, isn't it? Because now you've put yourself in that constraint. All right. So you alluded to money. How difficult in the documentary world, which is not known for earning tons of money, how do you raise money? What do you do?
It's been an evolution because when I started making documentaries, there was mostly just grant money for documentaries. You applied for grants or you got funding through a licensing agreement with PBS. My film Sunset Story, that was a licensing agreement. They gave me a certain amount of money. I mean, I had shot most of the film and cut it.
So you were hired to work on that.
No, it was a licensing agreement. So I made most of the film, brought it to them. They wanted it. And so then they gave me enough money to finish it.
I see.
And
Okay.
reimburse us for lots of it. And then, the transaction is that then they get it for PBS. It ended up being on Independent Lens. With other films I've done with City of Gold, I raised money on my own.
Mhm.
With Ottolenghi and the Cakes of Versailles, that came through an outside financer that my producer knew, who just funded the whole thing. With Food and Country, which is my most recent full-length documentary, it was a combination of equity partners and donations, but people who were donating big chunks of money.
Mhm.
So a lot of that funding, a lot of the sort of private equity, the sort of, investors, so to speak, that's very hard to come by now because the documentary market is so sad right now.
Yes, it is.
They're just not, you used to be able to take a film to Sundance and it was still hard to sell it there, but you could sell it and recoup most of your investment. It's almost unheard of now.
So how do you then approach it? How do you approach people when they probably know this?
I mean, the last time I raised money through private equity was in 2020. And that's before it completely, there was still hope of getting money back, recouping money.
Right.
I haven't
Right.
raised money for a film that way since then. And I don't think I would feel comfortable approaching a private investor right now saying, I hope I can make your money back.
But you absolutely need people that, just like any kind of risk venture capital, they have to be willing to take the risk that they're going to lose the money. And hopefully they look at it as a potential deduction.
They look at it as a deduction. And in the case of documentaries, there's groups of investors out there that also are investing because they love documentary. They're hoping to get their money back. But their biggest reason for investing is they are investing in the social impact of the film.
Mhm. So the companies like HBO that has had a docs division, I don't know if they still do or not, HBO, but
It's a shadow of its former self. Let's just put it that way.
mhm. So those things have started to disappear a little bit. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm not an expert in any of this, but I can tell you, I mean, mostly what happened was there was a period of time where the streamers or HBO or IFC, these companies would go to festivals, they would acquire independently made films, and then they would show it. And you do a worldwide deal with them or a North American deal with them. What those streamers kind of figured out is that they can make those on themselves, make them for themselves and commission them. So they started doing a lot of that work. I think what they realized is that they're not moneymakers. And so the algorithm started showing them that they're going to commission documentaries about celebrities, music, true crime, or cults. And if it kind of falls outside those things, I mean, I'm completely generalizing,
but less so about food.
Yeah, I mean, they're still doing food things, but I think it's, the most recent film I did, Food and Country, is really about how broken the American food system is.
Mm-hmm.
They don't see that as a very commercial topic.
No, it's got to be a little bit challenging to make that attractive.
Yeah, exactly.
Indeed. Well, let's talk about the power of film for a moment, because I think it's a miracle that you managed to pull that off in many different ways. And you worked on that together with Doug Prey, who has also been a guest on this show. And anyone listening to this episode, you'll definitely want to check out Doug Prey's episode as well, which is outstanding. How did you decide to make a documentary about Howard Suber's life's work, basically, which is the power of film and his pattern recognition, and deciding, or he decides, this is what he sees in many different movies and stories, and this is what storytelling is?
Yeah, Doug and I both, we were at UCLA Film School at different times. We were both Howard's TAs, but Doug and I knew each other just from the documentary world and a little bit through UCLA. And we were having lunch with Howard one day, and Howard had always thought that his lectures could be some sort of like PBS type series in a way.
Sure.
And he had gone down the road with a couple of other former students and nothing had panned out. And we were all having lunch, and Doug and I just kind of looked at each other like, let's just make this happen. Let's just do this, right? So we started collaborating on that, and it's a long story, so I'm not going to bore you with all the details. But
well, how many years did you work on it?
We started working on it in 2016, and actually shot a pilot that we ended up abandoning.
Okay,
the approach didn't work. I mean, it worked. It just wasn't it. It was Doug's idea. Finally, he's like, Laura, let's just keep it super simple and like shoot it all in an Interrotron and just have Howard speaking to the camera and intercut it with film clips.
Explain for the listeners that don't know what an Interrotron is.
So an Interrotron is something that Errol Morris, the great documentary filmmaker, basically invented. And essentially I don't have to go into the technical aspects of it, but the experience of watching something on an Interrotron is that the subject, the person speaking, is looking directly into the audience's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Usually you're set up with a camera and you're next to the camera and the subject is looking at you. So it's a little off. It just gives it an immediacy.
Right. It feels personal because you're really like looking into the character's eyes. Where typically on camera, most characters on camera are not looking into the camera at all.
Not at all.
Newsreaders look into the camera.
Yes.
But the Interrotron is a little bit different even. It's even more intimate.
It's more intimate. And what it also does, it still allows you in real life when you're shooting it, Howard's actually looking at us. Mm-hmm. So we can nod and smile and kind of give him encouragement as directors do when they interview people. But the way it's set up, I don't even.
You're able to have a conversation with him basically through the camera.
That's right.
Well, that's a big difference. Kind of like I know that the listeners can't see you and I having a conversation, but we're actually talking to one another on screen. And it's not like an Interrotron, but it is in a way like an Interrotron.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
So tell the listeners what is in the power of film and why they should even bother watching it.
So, I mean, I'll start out by saying that Howard Suber's these classes he taught at UCLA were legendary, and that's not hyperbolic. I mean, they really were. It's like
they were legendary. I agree.
Yeah, you landed at UCLA and people would say, you can't leave without taking his class.
Exactly right.
Right? And I just remember like my brain exploding basically when I started taking his classes. I couldn't believe it's the combination of the scholarship behind it and the knowledge of film history coupled with having it be so relatable and emotional. And the thing that I loved about him is that he always made you think about your own life and your own trajectory, even when he was talking about a movie. He's a powerful performer, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
He finds a way to engage you and then weave in these sort of examples, whether it's from, Greek mythology or a funny anecdote from a set, of The Graduate, that just keep you kind of listening and wanting to learn more. And they teach you how to look at movies and understand movies differently.
Once he tells you this stuff, and his book, The Power of Film, is absolutely fantastic as well. But once he starts to talk about these different elements of storytelling, you realize how obvious they should
Yeah,
be, but aren't. They're not obvious, but he makes it obvious to you, and then you can never
that's right.
forget them. And the thing that I think you were talking about a moment ago, which is really wonderful, is that he, which I had never thought about before his class, that what's happening in storytelling, and especially in movies, the
Mhm.
power of it is that stories are really about us.
Yeah.
And so that's how we relate, why we relate, and how we relate to movies and TV shows and books and so on, is that storytelling. Well, I never thought of it that way. I always thought of it as kind of a separate thing, but he makes it personal.
He makes it personal. So you too are understanding that you're having a catharsis, right? Because there are things that are being set up in the movie. For example, like one of my favorite things, it's the name of one of our episodes. It's called Trapped.
Trapped,
We
absolutely.
go to movies to see people in these traps and then figure out how to get out of them, because we all feel trapped in our lives to certain
Totally.
degrees and at varying amounts and throughout our lifetime.
As he says, almost every movie that's of any value, what he calls memorable popular movies, could be called Trapped.
Trapped. Yeah. So that's like one of his kind of overarching themes that you just like, then every time you see a movie, you're thinking to yourself, how is this character trapped and how are they going to get out of it? And you start thinking about your own life. Oh, I do feel trapped by this circumstance in my life.
Absolutely. So the Power Film, which is 6 parts, they're about 40, 45 minutes per episode. How long did it take you to gather up the hundreds of clips that are in this documentary?
A huge part of making the Power Film was really the editing process, of course. And we had 2 editors on board at different times, Avel Kamborian, who was our first editor, and then Philip Owens, who was our second editor, who did a lot of heavy lifting. But then Doug Prey, my collaborator, is an editor as well, and he was the supervising editor, but did a lot of the editing in the last several months to really make the series come together and sing. So I just wanted to mention that. But yeah, the clips were tricky for legal reasons, and also because we're cutting to films all the time. And so we really wanted to find a balance in terms of contemporary films, old films, different types of films, to cut in under or over or cut away from Howard speaking about whatever he was speaking about. And that was a process that was it was really a process of trying things, seeing if they worked, editing, re-editing, swapping out clips, trying new ones, finding the balance. And we were able to use all the clips through fair use, which is part of the US copyright law.
Right. Fair use being that you have the right to use it, especially in an educational sense.
Because it's transformational.
Right.
Howard is actually explaining something that's going on in a clip.
100%. What the listeners should know about it is there's no one else in this 6 parts except Howard talking into the camera about these various elements. But then it's intercut with tons and tons of clips from very famous, memorable, popular movies.
That's right.
This is not some offbeat little nobody's ever heard of movies. This is Chinatown and The Godfather and Citizen Kane and famous movies.
That's right.
So how did you then decide which clips to go? I know you were saying you're swapping them in and out. How do you make that decision?
This is where Doug and Howard and I worked the most closely. We just watched every single iteration of a cut and would give notes to each other and say, I think we should, swap this out. And then we'd like brainstorm of which clip we would use, or Philip Owens would have an idea of a clip we would use. It was like a group effort in terms of figuring out how to find that right balance. Or someone would go back and rewatch a film and be like, wait, hey, I know, we should use this particular scene in Do the Right Thing, or whatever it was. That was probably one of the most collaborative parts of the process, was really giving notes to our editors, talking about it. Howard and Doug and I Zoomed a lot just to review kind of where we were and
Mhm.
which episodes needed more work and which episodes were not that great yet and how to make them better. Even when Doug was doing a lot of the editing in those last several months, he would just try out new clips and then send them to us and say, what do you think of this? Is this better? It was a process. And then the other final part of the process was that we had to send it to our entertainment attorneys, to their fair use experts. And then I wish I could show you the spreadsheet of the entire series with all the clips in it and all the columns, whether it was approved or not approved, and then the note from the attorney, you need to cut this clip down by 3 seconds.
So the approval was based on time, the amount of footage?
Time, well, some of it's based on time. As our attorneys would tell us, it's more of an art than a science.
Yes.
So sometimes it was time. Sometimes Howard wasn't talking about the movie specifically enough.
Ah, okay.
So we'd have to go get some voiceover from Howard
Okay.
to make it true fair use. But then that would mean like reshuffling things and recutting things. It was a puzzle, it really was.
Well, yeah, I imagine when you watch it, you can't help but think this was a great big jigsaw puzzle to put together.
It was a great big jigsaw puzzle, yeah. And so that was the last phase of editing, was really, and at times it was heartbreaking to have to cut something down. And then at time, again, back to this idea of constraints, sometimes it made it better.
Sure. Made it tighter.
Tighter, yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's one of the things that screenwriters and movie directors and producers go through all the time. How can you make it tighter?
Yep.
And that's one of the things that Howard talks about is removing the excess on a story that you don't need.
Cutting in as late as you can into a scene and getting out as early as you can,
Well, his famous, I call it the E=MC² of storytelling, which is his definition of structure, which is the relationship of the pieces and parts to each other and to the whole. And that's a very simple sounding phrase, just like E=MC² is simple sounding.
Right.
But it's actually profound.
Yeah.
The relationship of the pieces and parts to each other and to the whole.
Yep.
It means that everything has to be of a piece.
Yep.
And ultimately, I think I'm going to pay you a very high compliment. I think you folks made such a spectacular series because it's so tight and so well drawn and so clear and understandable that something that could be completely a mess and very difficult to fathom is quite easy to understand. And it's really entertaining. That's the other part of it. It's super entertaining. It's not boring at all.
It really isn't. I know. I love that you emphasize that, because I think people can be a little scared off by it, that it's going to be a professor sort of lecturing at you. It doesn't feel that way.
No, not at all.
What happens to people is they watch it and they're like, oh my God, I need to go see that film again, or I haven't seen that film. It also just gets you excited about cinema.
100%.
That's what we need.
It's like you've got a wise old shaman of movie making telling you the profundity of what is in a story. And it's absolutely wonderful to watch. And you would think that it could drag or be slow. It isn't. It's very exciting to watch. How long did it take you to actually shoot all of the footage that you shot of Howard?
So we shot very quickly. We shot in 6 days.
6 days.
But there was a lot of prep. We spent time with Howard kind of talking about, as you know, Steve, because you were his student, he would lecture for 3 to 4 hours.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And then you'd have him for an entire quarter. And remember, we had all those handouts, like just the outlines and outlines and outlines. So one of the challenges was like, okay, we need to focus this down and kind of do the greatest hits,
Well, you don't cover the entire book. You cover the best parts of it.
Yeah, you cover the best parts. And which parts would lend themselves to kind of the best clips was also a factor.
Sure.
And Howard spent a lot of time kind of honing some outlines he thought he wanted. I think we had 7 or 8 different episodes at first. And then we also had another collaborator, another former student in T.A. Howard's, Joey Sierra, who really sat with Howard and helped him hone and hone and hone. And then we just got on the stage and went through them. And, Howard, he had notes next to him, and Joey would sit off to the side while Doug and I were directing and feed him character names or titles if he had forgotten them or something like that.
Right.
Kind of prompt him a little bit. But mostly Howard just had the lecture idea and he would just talk. He was not reading off of a script.
as memory serves, you'd go into a class with Howard and he had no notes in front of him and he talked for 3 hours. You'd think it was extemporaneous, which in a way it is, but he'd been teaching it for 50
Yeah,
years.
yeah,
And so it was like the back of his hand.
yeah.
And that's part of the beauty of what you get in The Power of Film is that it feels like he's just rattling off these wonderful things to you without it being difficult in some way or he's having to dredge it up. No, it's just flowing off of his tongue.
It's flowing, and he's a great storyteller. That's the thing, you know?
Absolutely is. And the book, which of course is based on the lectures and the whole thing's based on the lectures, the book is very little tiny bites of stuff. And that's what the TV series feels like as well. Little bites of information that are very interesting and compelling to watch. Where can people find The Power of Film if they want to find it?
Yeah, we premiered on Turner Classic Movies on January 4th of this past year, 2024. It is now available to stream on Max as well as Amazon and iTunes. So if you have Max, you can stream it for free. TCM will still continue to play it, but it's, they're kind of old. They're not a streamer. So sometimes they do a marathon run of it the day after Thanksgiving. They ran all 6 episodes, but Max or any of the other kind of places you find your content, now you can find it there.
And not that anybody's buying or watching DVDs anymore, but are DVDs available?
Yeah, thank you for asking. We will have DVDs and Blu-rays, which are exciting because we actually have a lot of cinephiles who have contacted us about Blu-ray versions of this for their collections on our website, thepoweroffilm.com, and those should be available in early January.
I know. I want a copy on Blu-ray.
Oh, well, you're just going to get one. We'll send you one.
I look forward to that.
The other thing I would just add is that we're also available for educational distribution. So colleges and universities and community colleges can purchase it for their libraries. And to purchase it for that type of use, you go to a company called Good Docs, GOODDOCS, and you can purchase it there too.
Cool. Good Docs. Last technical question I'm going to ask you. Obviously, the manufacture, production, and so on about making a movie, any movie, is that it's all about working with other people, collaboration. What for you makes good collaborations work?
Oh, gosh. Well, first of all, I will say that for me, my chief joy in making films is the collaboration. That is my favorite part because there's nothing better than sitting in a room with people you respect and having ideas accumulate so you get to a better idea. I think a lot of it's chemistry. Oftentimes it's complementary sort of skills, but a lot of it is just chemistry. And I think sort of an openness and a willingness to listen to other people, I mean, I love to have, I'm someone who is like, if someone has a better idea than I do when I'm directing, I say, thank you very much. Let's try it.
You're open to that.
I'm very open to that. And I want that. And it's more fun for everybody that way too. And if it makes it better, then why not?
That's absolutely right, because you can't help but work with other people. It's almost impossible to make any movie literally by yourself.
It's impossible. Yeah.
Well, I assume some over the course of the history of movies that's happened, but that's going to be very unusual. Most of the time you have to be willing to work with other people.
Yeah. And I think even Howard I remember this vaguely, and I don't know if I can remember the examples, but he used to talk about collaboration a lot. And that some of the directors who did their best work, if you look back at their work, it's because they worked with a certain cinematographer for those 2 movies.
Oh, sure.
There are these partnerships, these creative partnerships that are just gold.
Well, we see that all the time where a Clint Eastwood, a Steven Spielberg, they work with the same collaborators over and over again. Martin Scorsese and Thelma Schoonmaker and Steven Spielberg and Michael Kahn. And you see the same people over and over again.
Yeah.
And that's because they actually are able to communicate on a different level at some point.
That's right.
They become simpatico in some way.
Yeah.
So I've been having just the most fun conversation for not quite an hour now with Laura Gabbert, the documentarian, and we're going to wind the show down a little bit. And I'm just wondering, in all of your experiences, are you able to share with us a story that's either weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or maybe just plain funny?
Yeah, I will say that one of the things I found fascinating was to shoot, when we shot Ottolenghi and the Cakes of Versailles, we shot at the Metropolitan Museum of Art a lot. And I just had never shot anything like in a place like that.
Sure.
And what was crazy about it was that, they have Met employees with you the entire time with our crew. And we were shooting there for maybe a full week every day.
Wow.
So I literally had someone behind me the whole time who would like hold my shoulder.
Really?
If I was backing up with the camera and got like maybe like 6 inches too close to a piece of art. I mean, it was like she was stuck to me for a week, this woman.
That's weird.
It is kind of weird. I mean, I was grateful because I don't want to damage anything in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but it was a very different way of working, is having this person literally glued to me the entire time and to my camera person.
Well, that was your safety buffer.
Exactly. So
because otherwise you very well might have damaged something.
Yeah, exactly.
Because there's a lot of stuff in there that you can damage.
And then the other thing that was interesting about there is like there were certain, there's all these tunnels that connect the Metropolitan Museum of Art and all these back alleyways where they store art. There are places where you had to turn your camera off because there are security issues about where they store art.
Really?
Yeah. So they would say, okay, all cameras off right now. And so we'd go through this long tunnel with these huge crates of, ancient art, and we couldn't film it because there could be possible security breaches.
Really? Isn't that interesting?
Fascinating,
Did that feel like the end of Citizen Kane?
A little bit, yes.
Great big crates of art.
Yes.
But probably not a giant room like they have in
not quite. Yes, not quite.
Warehouse, giant warehouse.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. So, all right, last question for you today, Laura. You've already given us huge amounts of advice throughout this entire show, but I'm wondering if you have a single solid piece of advice or a tip that you like to give to those that are starting out in the business, or maybe they're in a tiny bit and trying to get to the next level.
It's an easy one for me because I talk to so many young filmmakers like on a weekly basis. I enjoy mentoring people. And I meet a lot of people who have who watch a lot, who consumed a lot. I also meet a lot of young people who want to be in film who haven't watched that many movies. They haven't watched that many documentaries. If they want to make documentaries, they don't really know the history of making documentaries. And right now it's so easy. You can see almost anything, right? My big advice is do your homework. See what's been made before you go make your film. Not because you want to copy it. You need to understand the context in which you're making something and what's been done before.
Well, that is absolutely spot on advice, because I taught at a school here in Pittsburgh called Point Park University for more than 10 years. And it is evident that a lot of young people today are not studying the history of the motion picture industry or movies or storytelling.
Yep.
And yes, that's what you need to do. And you need to understand what came before us so that you're standing, as the old phrase is, you're standing on the shoulders of giants.
That's correct.
And then you can take it to the next level. Otherwise, you don't know what you're talking about most of the time.
Or if you want to reference it, you can, but you're doing it in a knowing way. There are ways, because we all mimic each other. I mean, it's not like, yes, people are innovative and they sort of invent new formal things about filmmaking, but I also find it just inspiring. And it's also just, it gives you ideas. It's sort of, and even watching films that maybe you don't love, like what do you love about it? What don't you love about it? What works about it for you? What doesn't work for you? I just think it's important that people just spend more time just watching as many films as possible.
I think that's absolutely right. The more that you understand how it works and the way that things cut and how performances work and tone and all those kinds of things, how the story's told, you can only get better by studying more and more of it.
Absolutely.
Laura Gabbert, this has been a fantastic hour on StoryBeat, and I cannot thank you enough for your time, your energy, and especially for your wisdom in all things filmmaking and documentaries. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been delightful, Steve. Thanks so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.